Hello and good afternoon. I'm Sam Thompson, Senior Managing Director at Progress Partners, and I'm happy to welcome you all to this week's panel, Exploring TV Production Innovation. This week's panel brings together some thought leaders from the television industry to discuss how COVID has impacted their respective lines of business and how innovative solutions have met audience demand for entertainment in a locked down world. Enjoy yourself, enjoy the panel, and let me hand it off to Marianne Halford to take it from here.
Thanks, Sam. It's great to have you all here today for what we hope will be an entertaining webinar. We have with us today Leonard Dick, the writer-producer of some amazing shows that you've all watched, including the loss. I'm making a mistake here. The Good Wife on CBS, which was a great show and a show I loved. John McDonnell from the Tennis Channel and a former colleague of mine from Fox, and Philip Stamp, who's the creative director at Island of Misfits. So I'm going to have each one of them briefly introduce themselves, and then we're going to launch into the questions. Leonard?
Hi, thanks, Marianne. I'm Leonard Dick. I am a TV writer-producer. I started actually on the business side of the industry as a finance executive at Disney, but my real interest and passion was being on the creative side. I became a TV writer, worked mostly on a bunch of canceled shows that you never heard of because they didn't make the first commercial break. But I was also fortunate enough to work on Lost, House, The Good Wife for most of its run, and more recently I've been working on some new streaming shows. I worked on the new Apple service, the show Truth Be Told with Octavia Spencer and Aaron Paul, and more recently I just finished working on a new HBO Max series, which we'll discuss in a bit, and I've also been writing pilots for the various networks.
Great. Sounds like you've been busy regardless of COVID. Yeah. John.
Thanks, Marianne, and thanks everyone for joining us today. My background is, like Leonard, I came mostly from a business background, and I've spent most of my time in the television business, mostly on the entertainment side, even though I find myself in the sports world these days. I worked for a while at 20th Century Fox on the syndication side, so on the program sales side, helped launch a couple of cable networks, including Fine Living Network and the Oprah Winfrey Network. I most recently was up in Canada running a portfolio of lifestyle networks for Chorus Entertainment, for those of you of a Canadian origin in the audience tonight. And currently, as Marianne mentioned, I'm running programming for the Tennis Channel. Tennis now being very notorious because over the last weekend, one of the big stars, Novak Djokovic, came down with COVID. So I imagine that will somehow weave its way into our conversation today, but I'm very happy to be here.
Great. And Philip?
Hi there. So basically my background really comes more from the creative side of the industry. I've been working in animation and visual effects for about 27 years now. Worked for a number of notable companies, helping get things, everything from building studios, helping other people build their studios, up to including co-founding now 2 animation studios, one in Southeast Asia called One Animation, where we notably created a property called The Oddbods, which is quite popular in Asia and China and other parts of the world, lesser known here. Returned to Canada in about 2012, 2013 to take a position as a VP of animation with DHX Media and oversaw a number of animated projects there. Recently joined a couple of partners, notably Dana Landry, the former CEO of DHX Media, to join as a partner in the Island of Misfits, where we currently find ourselves developing a number of different properties. And I'm sure we'll probably talk a little bit about that coming up as well.
Terrific. Okay, so Leonard, you're currently a writer-producer for the upcoming HBO Max original series called Crime Farm, a series to be produced by Warner's and Nicole Kidman's production company. So you're busy most of the early part of the year. You've got 5 episodes down. Then comes Friday the 13th of March, and you're told the writer's room must disband, but you're only halfway getting your writing assignment done for, which was committed, I guess, to be delivered to HBO Max by the beginning of May, correct?
That's right, May 1st. We were supposed to turn in 10 scripts.
So what did you do? How did you
Uh,
handle it?
The analogy I would cite, it's a little bit like we were on a touchdown drive and got stopped on the 32-yard line. It's interesting how the streaming world is different from the broadcast TV world. Just to give a little context, in broadcast TV, ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, what most of us have grown up with, there's a very fixed schedule. You start your writer's room in June. You start writing your scripts, you start filming in July, you're on the air in September, and the train keeps moving pretty much through April. And in the streaming world, what's happening increasingly is a show will get ordered, say a 10-episode order, and all the scripts will be written, and then the show will go into production with just keeping a couple of the writers on, usually the creator showrunner, and maybe one or two other senior people. And that's the model that we were looking at for our show. And so we had our writer's room started in June of 2019, and there were 8 or 9 of us, with including one of our part-time writers, and we mapped out the whole season. We had all 10 episodes broken. Then we started working on outlines and writing scripts and working on the first 5 episodes, and we had 5 left to go. And then, it's funny, it actually started with what I call Tom Hanks Wednesday. And then we were told on like Tom Hanks Wednesday that our writer's room was just going to stop on the 13th. So what it meant was episodes 6 through 10 still had to be written. And I was slated to write episode 6 and also to co-write the season finale with our creator and showrunner. And so what happened was we effectively went from a team of writers to a group of individual writers, because given the collective bargaining agreement between the Writers Guild of America and the studios, once the writer's room was shut down, we were no longer officially kind of employed by the studio. So everybody, for all intents and purposes, became a freelancer. So what that meant was we could not chime in on other people's episodes. So yesterday, 8 of us were sitting around the table talking about what's the act 2 break going to be in episode 9. And then the next day, we weren't allowed to chime in. So what that meant in practical terms for me was when I finally got to co-writing episode 10, the season finale, there were things that had changed in episodes 7, 8, and 9 that I wasn't aware of. We pulled the story point from episode 9 into 8. There was a dog that was actually integral to the story. The dog's name changed. So it became this bizarre kind of disconnect in terms of process, where I spent all these months sitting in the same conference room with this terrific group of writers doing a really fun, interesting show. And then I'm just sitting at home writing my episode and then writing the next episode, not knowing what's happening in the other episodes. I wasn't even reading the episodes 7, 8, or 9 as they came in. And then, of course, the big question, and so we wrote all the episodes, we turned them into HBO Max, and the plan was to get a production green light and then start casting and filming, but all of that is on hold like the rest of the industry.
Wow. So why couldn't you have done Zoom sessions during that period so that you were all collaborating?
It's because technically it is actually it is part of the collective bargaining agreement. We were no longer employees of the studio. So and this is a little bit of minutia, but all of our initial terms of our contracts had expired earlier. So we were all on extensions. So what it meant was that when that week ended on March 13th, they were no longer going to extend us. So we were no longer employed as a staff. And since we were no longer technically employed as a staff, you're not allowed to work as a staff. You now become solely responsible. I was solely responsible for episode 6, and my other colleague was solely responsible for episode 7. Like we would get on the Zoom with with Janine Sherman Barwa, who created the show, and she would give some thoughts and notes, and we worked that way. So that was normal course of business. But what we didn't have was the benefit of 6 or 7 other voices, people pitching ideas. Hey, what if we move that? What if we improve that? What if we change that and move that from episode 8 to episode 7? So it became much more of the screenwriter's experience rather than the television writer's experience, where you were working individually. And my experience is interesting, but and I was also comparing notes with some writers who were on broadcast TV shows who were still in production and had maybe another 5 or 6 episodes to go. And in some cases, their room stopped and then they resumed and they finished the episodes for the current season and started the next season. But again, question mark, nobody knows when production's going to start. So there's a larger question of, is all of this going to lead to anything?
Wow. And how did the final series turn out in terms of the written product? Do you feel it?
I'm the wrong person to ask because I think it's awesome, right? Like, it's a really cool series. It's based on this. It's a serialized crime drama that's based on this real life couple, and it's just it's a really interesting. It's a really interesting idea, and I think the execution is great. So I think it turned out great, right? And so we're just hoping that HBO Max, officially gives the show a green light, because I, for one, think it deserves to be on a screen.
Well, when will you find out?
It's TBD. Like, it's interesting, and Philip and John might be able to speak to this as well, is there's this incredible brain power in this industry. There's some very smart, strategic thinkers. Nobody knows. Nobody knows what the immediate future is going to be or the long-term future. I know I talked to one friend who's a senior writer, producer on one of the big shows on ABC, and they shoot up in Canada, in Vancouver, and there's a plan to start filming again at the end of July. However, what is the state of the COVID spread going to be? Is Canada going to force people, Canada going to require people quarantining? There are so many moving parts, and it's much like it's analogous to, I'm sure everyone's been reading about the sports leagues professional sports leagues trying to find a way back in, and it's very fluid, and nobody knows anything definitive. And I've talked to some very accomplished people, very smart people. Nobody has an answer. Nobody knows what it's going to look like tomorrow, next week, never mind 6 months from now.
Philip, I think you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, I mean, I have dozens of questions, some self-serving, some just curious. But, one of the big things that I'm curious about is whether or not there's been any discussion concerning folding the current quarantine scenario into contemporary drama, and whether or not that would be of any benefit to the planning of the shooting.
Do you mean in terms of content or in terms of process?
In terms of content.
Oh, it's interesting. I don't know the answer. It's interesting. Like right now, I'm actually writing a couple of pilot projects. But while no one has said this directly, I think it's such a heavy, exhausting period we're all living in, that in some ways I don't think, if you believe that television and movies are supposed to be escapist, I think more so than ever people don't want to hear about it. I'm sure it'll be part of individual stories, but I don't think you're going to see COVID CSI, on TV. I, for one, wouldn't want to see that, but I do think you are going to see it's affected the world so much that it can't not be part of the content. And I just along the same lines, what we're seeing in terms of our what's happening socially with all the protests and I think that will also inform content along the way. But the question becomes, and I for one don't have an answer, is how much of that takes up sort of center stage, or is it just something that you see that at the margins that informs the main content?
Because it's a bit fascinating, even watching things now, where there's a bit of an awareness of what things were like in the before times versus now, and so it's kind of interesting going forward, thinking about how content will appear.
Well, here's what I can tell you. I talked to a lawyer at one of the big studios who works in the labor department, and something as simple as no more crowd scenes. You know, restaurant scenes, there'll be two background people in the restaurant, and everyone else will be CGI'd. And then it raises larger questions. How do you do a fight scene? How do you do a love scene? There are so many factors, things that we just take for granted, that I think on that level, on that axis, that's how content will be affected. It may not be, hey, we're not going to on screen. I don't think you're going to see in a script, we're not going to kiss because of coronavirus. But I just think you might see, instead of a kiss, you might see like a wave or a couple of elbow taps.
It's interesting. Well, John,
Hello.
so tennis.
Yeah.
We're missing Wimbledon right now. It's very sad, but we're going to have the U.S. Open in September, so thank God for that. But what are you doing right now to keep audiences engaged?
Well, it's, you know, we were, most of the networks that are focused on sports, obviously they rely on the steady stream of a competition across the major sports and stuff like that. And in many ways, it was seen as the salvation of sort of the broadcast television industry for a while, right? Because it was one of the few things that people needed to watch live and all that kind of stuff. And so we were typically very reliant on live sports. And so when this happened, we were fortunate at the Tennis Channel because we have the deals that we make with the tours gave us some replay rights and archive rights so we could play classic matches. Now, those don't do anywhere near the kind of ratings and draw the same kind of audiences as the typical, as live matches would and stuff. And so they're a solution to put something other than bars and tones on the screen, but it's certainly not a business that you would want to be relying on long term. And so it took a while for the tennis world to get their sea legs, if you will, and try and figure out, hey, maybe, you know, we've got clusters of players in different parts of the world because travel was obviously compromised. Tennis is both. It's fortunate in that there's not as much interaction, like direct contact, as there is in football or basketball or what have you. But the nature of the tennis world is that people are traveling around the world all the time. Every week they're in a different place. And so when you choke off the travel industry, it has a direct impact of what you can do and can't do in the tennis world. So, but you know, most of the most popular players, and we like a lot of the other media businesses, were star driven, and so the larger personalities in our sport, male and female, tend to cluster in certain places. There's a good group of people in Florida, for example, or some in Southern California. There's some in the south of France, and et cetera, around the world. And so some of these people started saying, well, you know what? I still need to hit a ball. I still need to stay in shape. So maybe we can put together some competitions, and maybe people will want to watch that, and maybe they miss tennis and stuff. And I think that's all, that is a true statement, and we've certainly learned that. And I'll show you something in a little bit, just to give you an idea of how disruptive, both from a sort of a business system standpoint, but also in terms of the way that people think about the sport can be. But I think the entire economic model, if you think about the nature of tennis, the tennis tours, it's a collection of individual tournaments, and those tournaments make their money by selling tickets and selling food and beverage and doing all those kinds of things. Well, we can get tennis players on the courts to hit balls back and forth, but we, you know, with some notable exceptions like Novak Djokovic that I mentioned at the top, you can't really bring fans in yet in any meaningful way. And Marianne, you mentioned the US Open. The plan for the US Open is to have no fans. And so that's got some production related implications as well. So you started to see these individual events start to crop up, and we did a one early on from a private court in someone's home in Florida, and we'd bring in jib cameras, and we'd brought in the drones, and thank God for drones nowadays. And we put together a round robin tournament of some, not the biggest stars in the US, but some ranked professional tennis players. And it was fun for a couple of weeks. We played over 3 days, and it was actually pretty good. During this time, and this will be a real test of sort of my prowess on Zoom, which I like to think I've become a little bit more capable with. There was one of the higher profile coaches, a guy named Patrick Mouratoglou, who is Serena Williams' coach. He's got a tennis academy in the south of France. And he said, now's my opportunity to try something brand new. I'm going to create a new type of tennis that will appeal to younger audiences. Tennis tends to be skewed very old. It's high income, not surprisingly, and stuff. And so his ambition was to try and rethink the game of tennis, applying new rules, new gimmicks, if you will, to try and make it more attractive to an audience that may be more accustomed to watching video games. So I'm going to try something here and see if I'll give you just a little taste of what this is. And it's called UTS, Ultimate Tennis Showdown. And so I'm going to try and turn up some volume, and we'll see if we can actually make this. But
Okay,
this
cool.
this is streaming off of Tennis Channel's streaming product called Tennis Channel Plus.
Tennis reinvented in a brand new format, a format that will bring intensity, excitement, and unpredictability. After an enthralling day session, the coverage of weekend 2 continues here in the beautiful south of France. And with a new format, of course, comes some new rules. So let's take a look at these. There are 4 quarters that last for 10 minutes each, and whoever is ahead once the buzzer goes wins that quarter. Similar to a tie break, players serve for 2 points each, but they have to be quick as there will be a 15-second shot clock between the points. If a quarter finishes in a tie, a deciding point is played to determine the winner of the quarter. And if both players are tied at 2 quarters apiece, an additional quarter is played in a sudden death format. More on that in just a couple of minutes' time. Well, opening the proceedings under the lights.
So I'll stop that there. But it gives you a sense if any of the people that are watching this are familiar with the tennis, a lot of those rules probably sound completely foreign. What are these quarters? What do you mean there's 2 points? Their ambition is to try and take some of these players, create characters not unlike the WWE. And one is called the Wall because he always hits the ball back. And they're using some of the top names in tennis. I got Alexander Zverev, Sasha Zverev, a German player, and Tsitsipas from Greece. So some of these higher profile players who've got nothing to do right now to tee up this new sport, this new version of the sport, I suppose. The hope is that this will catch on to a younger demographic. You know, they're playing rock and roll music. They've got the typical you see a lot more masks around the courts and a lot of hand sanitizer and all that kind of stuff, which is sort of the trappings that you generally see around any of these new tennis events now. And I think, you know, aside from UTS, which is perhaps the boldest experiment that I've seen, we started seeing some more familiar traditional tennis type events. There's one going on right now in Czechoslovakia with a lot of the top women. I mentioned the Novak event that was on for the last 2 weekends. They were staged in Croatia. Obviously, Novak Djokovic, who is the world #1 right now, very, very high profile in that country for sure. Croatia had a pretty good track record relative to COVID compared to other countries in the world. But part of in what is sort of the optics of what you do are in many ways as important as the actual things that you do. And they were seen with full stands, with fans packed in there, ball boys and ball girls.
Oh,
they played a soccer match beforehand with some of the players. And perhaps the coup de grace was shots after the first weekend of them out at a nightclub dancing and yeah. So it was not a good visual, but everything was going fine until last weekend. One of the top players, Grigor Dimitrov, who played in the tournament, was diagnosed as positive with COVID. And one of the other players in that tournament, Alexander Zverev, went to that UTS tournament that I just showed you, played the following weekend there. Dominic Thiem, another top player, went there. They were both tested negative for COVID, but that shows you sort of how these things can get out of hand.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody, and this is true across all sports, the PGA, the men's golf tour is going on right now, and they're starting to, they got back into action a couple weekends ago, and they're starting to see some of their higher profile players be diagnosed as positive. And the follow-on effects, they all had plans, and this is what our protocol is, and I've got a 60-page manual of how you're going to manage in this environment and stuff like that. And we're going to put people in a bubble. And what you realize is that these bubbles aren't airtight. And you got these follow-on implications of what happens when somebody does get diagnosed. Then what do you do with them? How long, what should they do while they're waiting for their test? Can they go out to the practice range? Can they go hit balls? And all of these kinds of things. And it's a much more complex system. I think Leonard was talking about, you just don't understand the complexity of these systems that are stitched together, and they work really well when nothing gets pulled out of it. But when you say, guess what, you can't have 5 more people in your restaurant scene, that really compromises how you think about telling stories.
And how are you going to plan for the U.S. Open? I assume there's going to be no audience at Arthur Ashe Stadium.
That's right. And in fact, to add further, to make it further complicated, there's a preliminary tournament in Cincinnati every year, a big tournament, and that Cincinnati tournament is also now going to be in New York. So they're moving the Cincinnati tournament to New York the week before the U.S. Open. They're going to have no fans there. I think the plan for the USTA was to do a dry run with the Cincinnati tournament to make sure that they've got all of their mechanics done. They're doing with a very small footprint. They've had to negotiate with a lot of the top players, because the idea was to put them in a bubble, put them all into hotels and stuff like that. But if you're, set aside Federer because he's not playing because he's got surgery, and Nadal's probably not going to come. But some of the top players are saying, well, I don't want to stay in a hotel. I rent a house. Okay, well, how do you throw a bubble around a house? It's one thing to put them into a hotel that you can control the back and forth between the stadium and stuff like that. And so and the nature of tennis is that these are individual contractors. So it's a collection of players that all operate as a group, but they're all individual operators and stuff. So there's going to be no fans. ESPN will produce it for everybody in the world. We typically would send a big crew of people there, both on the business side to do, those are our business meetings in some ways, but also with production crews, because we do a daily show there. That's not going to happen. We're going to produce that show from Los Angeles, not from New York. Even the mechanics of things that you may not automatically think of, but I was on the call with the USTA today, and they're talking about different technologies that they're looking to employ to pipe in audience sound both into the stadium for the players, so that they're not playing in a big cavern, but also for the fans at home. And what's the viewing experience going to be like if you're used to hearing people applaud after a great shot is hit, and now there's not going to be anybody, you'll hear crickets. And
hey,
so, John,
can I ask a question? Yeah, I'm curious, in tennis, how much of the revenue stream for the tournaments and the like come from television versus audience attendance? Because I'm thinking about, looking at what's happening with Bundesliga. I know everybody in the world, in the sports world, is watching what's happening, and so and they're doing exactly what you described. And I'm wondering what the financial breakdown is, and also as your industry looks to what's happening in European soccer, is that encouraging, discouraging, or neutral?
Yeah. So like everything in life, it depends. So for the big tournaments, like the Grand Slams and some of the bigger ATP and WTA tournaments, television revenues bring in a ton of money for them, right? I think the deal for the US Open alone with ESPN is like over $70 million a year, right? And so when you get down to some of the other lower level tournaments, and so in the men's tour, they have 250s, which are the lowest, then they have 500s, which are a little bit bigger, then they have 1000s, which are the step below the Grand Slams and stuff. The bigger the tournament, the more important the television revenues tend to be. The lower the level of the tournament, the more they're reliant on ticket sales and sponsorship sales and all that kind of stuff. I think from a broadcasting standpoint, we're looking to everybody who's sort of facing a similar situation to us, like the Bundesliga and like other sports, to understand what the reaction that audiences will have to watching live sports in an empty stadium, because it's jarring in many ways. Does it matter to people? We don't know. I think we all watched with interest in the early stages of the COVID. At the experimentation that other networks were doing. ESPN was running cornhole tournaments, for crying out loud. And they were doing video games, esports, right, were a big thing. What you found was that there was an initial interest in some of these things. in most cases, I think it's probably fair to say that the interest fell off after an initial curiosity and an initial people saying, you know, there's this big thing, people will watch anything because there's nothing on. And so they're just so desperate for it. Well, the truth, that's not really true. I think people will try some things, but as you know specifically, Leonard, and Philip probably knows as well, I mean, there's more than enough choice out there if you're watching Netflix or Amazon or HBO Max, or you fill out the alphabet soup nowadays, that you can always find something compelling to be on. You may be missing football or tennis or basketball or hockey or what have you, but there's plenty of things to keep you occupied. And so I think it's a fallacy to say people will watch anything. And I think we all want to get back into the swing of things before people say, you know what, I didn't really miss tennis as much as I thought I might, or I didn't miss baseball as much as I thought I might. And in some of those cases, those fans may be gone for good.
Well, let's hope we can get the games back in play sooner rather than later. I think it's important for all of us. I have watched a little bit of soccer, and what they're doing is they're actually piping in audio from the FIFA 20 game. So they've licensed that from Electronic Arts, and they're piping that into the stadium. And then they have, I guess, these images of people supposedly in the stands, but I don't think that's only for broadcast purposes. That's not what the players are getting. Yeah, I think sport is an important part of us as a culture, and I definitely hope it comes back soon. Philip, though, your work in an interesting area. Animation, from what I gather from talking to a number of people in the industry, a lot of animation production has kept on going. There have been some challenges, but what's it been like for Island of Misfits during this period, and how are you innovating around that?
Well, it was very interesting, and you know, back at the start of this, we kind of saw this, you know, this wave, of COVID-19 progressing westward across Europe, and you know, a number of people in the studio. We have about 140 people in our studio currently, spread across a couple of productions, and several people had relatives in Europe, and most notably in Italy, and in just sort of through personal connections as well as the news, we watched you know, what was happening. So we sort of independently decided that we should prep just in case, you know, that we were going to have to try and find some way to continue working from home. And, you know, I'll never forget going to my director of IT, and like all IT directors, who's, you know, harried and hard done by on the best of days, and tired of answering stupid questions from a lot of them, often from me. And I said to him one day, I think we need to prepare to have 140 people work from home. To which he rolled his eyes and said, really? And I said, yeah, really. And then he just got to work and buckled down and got it ready. And when the day came to pull the trigger, we had about 140 people that went from all being in the studio to all working from home, just like that. And you know, the message that we had a town hall via Zoom like this, sort of the following week, and the message that I said to the crew was, if you can work, then we can work. Simple as that. So one of the biggest challenges in it was actually not even technology. We were able to get a broad enough pipe into our servers so that all the artists could be pushing and pulling a lot of heavy files, and animation files are fairly large, like a lot of digital image files are very large. So they were pushing and pulling a lot of data across the, you know, the internet in a very heavy duty kind of way, but we were to prep for it and compensate for it. So we really rolled into, you know, the quarantine scenario really without missing a beat. The two areas that were very, very challenging, number one, just harkening back to a scenario similar to what Leonard was talking about, where, you know, you had a situation with a bunch of writers in a room, and obviously there's a different kind of deal there because of you know, contractual agreements and so on. But regardless, the creative process is very collaborative, particularly in animation, requires a lot of review. Many times, been asked the question, how do you direct animated characters? And I mean, the way you direct animated characters is you will have a team of potentially, anywhere from 20 to 40 animators who are the performers of all of the characters. And so the only way to get consistency and is daily review. And that kind of daily review, usually our studio is not unique in this regard. Most studios do this, where your directors and your supervisors go around to everyone's workstation or desk and weigh in on notes and give feedback to the artists to maintain that consistency. And suddenly we had to figure out a way to do that and still maintain that sense of collaboration. And that was quite a challenge. And a lot of that was less smooth. We were able to sort of do it, but at the end of the day, many of the artists still, myself included, really missed that interaction with the team and really being able to ask questions. When you're sitting around an area and the other artists and your colleagues and peers are with, very easily, ask questions. What do you think of this? What do you think of that?
So you
definitely from home.
So you could definitely relate to a lot of what Leonard was talking about in terms of
very much so,
his overall experience.
Yeah, suddenly being at home was a real challenge to maintain that creative momentum. The other thing in it, I will say, from an overall kind of leadership perspective, as some of us find ourselves in as producers, is was really maintaining across a crew of a number of people a positive attitude and reiterating that thing of saying, do what you need to do to keep your mental health and your emotional health where it needs to be. And of course, with everything happening in the world these days, that's not been easy, even on the best of days. But we did manage to do a number of things. And this is pretty much the case across a number of studios. The one thing that that we've all thought was a very interesting potential opportunity with this is what, we do anticipate an increased demand for animated content because of our ability to maintain production over the next little while without having that slow down. And with the audiences from their teens through the 20s being very interested in animated content, not just the comedies but the dramas and so on, and a lot of high consumption of Asian animated content. We've noticed we've already noticed an increased demand for animated content for that older demographic. So our anticipation at this point is that that's only going to go on. That was rising anyway, and we sort of are of this opinion that it's going to continue to increase.
Can I ask a question?
So, absolutely.
I wonder, Philip, do you think that this is going to create any kind of paradigm shift? Like once, God willing, once this thing ends, will it be back to a version of business as usual, or do you see a new model for working, developing, collaborating, etc.?
Oh, I mean, that's a great question. I think it's absolutely going to create a new model for collaborating. One of the things, as a studio owner, we have a very, very, very large space that's running a lot of overhead for us. And with everyone working from home, there's an obviousness to sort of reducing that overhead and being able to take that spend and put it into talent. So I definitely see a real shift in that overall how we run a studio, how we do business, how we collaborate, and whether or not we can have smaller collaborative groups as opposed to just one large space where we're running a lot of overhead. I think there's going to be a period of time where we do return to business as usual, but knowing that we can operate this way, there's an inevitability to change it.
Philip, I was wondering, because one of the things that we see that's happening in the business system, certainly I've spent most of my career in sort of linear cable networks principally and stuff, but you see all of these streaming services launching, and it seems like there's a new one every week. And as Leonard said, you know, traditional live action production is being sort of limited by the nature of what's required to produce those kinds of series. But all these services seem predicated on having original programming as their driving raison d'etre, right? And so I'm curious whether or not you're finding the Amazons and the HBO Maxes and the Peacocks and stuff like that coming out, and specifically to animation companies like Island of Misfits to say, you guys can actually make stuff for us. I'm going to have a voracious appetite over the next 2 or 3 years to try and build up an original programming offering. Have you seen anything like that, given that the live action stuff is probably going to be more directly affected and stymied for a while?
Not quite yet. I mean, you know, certainly the demand for content in the animation sector has been, we were already seeing an upward trend in demand for that already. And that trend has not slowed since the start of the pandemic. But we have in fact seen certainly a greater demand in the last year for animated content that targets what we'd call an adult audiences. I'm not talking about adult content as you would say in live action, but really things for for an older audience. Things with more sophisticated storylines and harsher language and situations and things like violence and so on. There's definitely been an increase in demand for that. And while we haven't heard it yet, because I think the greater question on most of the broadcasters and the streamers' minds has been simply, can we deliver the content that we have? Other folks in the industry, other studio owners and folks such as myself have been talking and sharing information, and everyone is of the same mind that we are anticipating a greater demand for that.
You know, Marianne, it's interesting, just an observation, just listening to John and Philip and my own experience. There are actually 3 seminars here, or webinars. There is what was happening before COVID, because I think in each of our respective fields, parts of the media world, like just huge upheaval and change at a head spinning rate, full stop. Then you have what's happening during COVID, this a period that is unprecedented that none of us have worked through. And then you have what's going to happen after. So I think for future, the good news for you is there are 3 big stories here, all of which have head spinning twists and turns and long-term implications.
Well, there are some questions coming in from the audience about the future. So I wanted to throw one of these at you. NECF is creating a marketplace for live TV production like Sabra. Is the TV industry ready to join the sharing economy?
That is a great question. I'll tell you what it looks like from my boots on the ground. We are operating in an increasingly siloed world. If you look at the entertainment industry, how it's changed in terms of corporate ownership from 50 years ago to 20, if you remember, I think it was in the 80s when, oh my God, GE was buying RCA, which owned NBC, and Capital City was buying ABC. That seems so quaint now.
Yeah.
And what we have now is almost like a European structure where you have these 4 or 5 enormous mega corporations that are becoming increasingly siloed. So it becomes, if you are a writer and you have a deal with, say, Universal Television, you're most likely they're going to direct you, please sell to NBC, USA Network. It's going to be harder to sell outside the company. So what that means is, as the walls go up and become more fortified, I wonder if it becomes harder for anything that sort of represents a kind of a lateral, whether sharing or cooperation, whatever you want to call it, just because the world is becoming increasingly siloed. The companies are, this is where my business background, I think, informs some of my thinking. These companies are right now and in the immediate future going to be under enormous pressure to get their earnings up.
Yeah.
that I think that their networks, their streaming services are going to favor their own studios, their own in-house studios, which will make it harder for the outside. And so, it's really about, like, on a creative level, for me, it's picking which silo do I want to be in business with. I actually have a project right now where I'm encountering that very point. It's a project that I'm doing with another writer friend and a producer who brought us the life rights of this very interesting woman. And we're trying to figure out, is this for Apple? Is this for CBS All Access? Is this for HBO Max? And so what we're looking for producer, some high profile producers to partner with us, but that high profile producer is exclusive to Apple, or this high profile producer is exclusive to HBO Max. So it makes anything lateral hard to do, because you have to look up 10 levels above you, figure out where you want to be, and then work from there. So this is the world we're living in, and it's quite a formidable challenge.
Do you think we're going back to some of the old studio system in a certain way? Different names, but
yeah, I think that's a really cool insight, because I think the answer is yes. And, the big example you hear about is this issue, the dispute between the Writers Guild of America and the talent agencies. And we had this big rift that happened, I guess, it's 14 months ago.
It's still unresolved.
And it was all over the issue of, primarily over the issue of packaging. Yeah. And the last time we had that kind of system was when Lou Wasserman was running MCA, and he owned the talent agency and he owned the studio that owned Universal Pictures. And the Justice Department said, no, that's antitrust. And he ended up selling off the talent agency. We are operating in a much different political environment. And so this total control model seems to be the model for the present, and certainly the model for the future. That's from, again, one POV from boots on the ground.
Leonard, I think you're completely wrong. No, I think what Leonard is saying is true today, but I think that the business system goes through cycles, right? And I think particularly when you're in a creative business, that's at its core, most of the value creation comes from the original creative idea, and how do you get those breakthrough creative ideas? And I think the verticalization, which I agree with Leonard, is happening right now. It's happened in the past as well, and it tends to go ebb and flow, I think, over time. And I don't know how long the cycle will last, but because the value creation is with the idea, these big conglomerates are trying to capture more and more of those ideas. And so they bring it into a centralized, vertically integrated system. The problem is it's hard for the truly breakthrough creative ideas to thrive in those kinds of systems, because, as I'm sure Philip and Leonard can attest, the iterations of notes you go through, and you have to compromise here because the buyer needs this and stuff like that. And you're trying to force your story into the appetites or the perceptions of a particular buyer can soften off the edges and take away the distinctiveness of a particular creative program. All of that is to say that I think what happens is either you get successful enough in that system so you don't really have to care, and you move out and you become sort of like a Carsey Warner, right? Where Carsey Warner became a mini studio on its own because they had some successful or some successful creators and executives went off and did their own thing. People said, holy mackerel, Carsey Warner, what a great business system. Let's get rid of all of these overall deals we've got with our creators. We have to go and let everybody go outside. And then you see how much money they make at Carsey Warner. And so you buy them up again and you bring them into the system. So either you get people that are so successful that they don't need the system, they're not as reliant on the system anymore, and that the studios want to work with them, or you get these truly innovative, new, original voices that don't fit into the traditional system, but because their content is so uniquely creative and compelling that they break through, and people go, oh my God, we need more fresh voices like a Family Guy or something like that. And it goes outside of the system for a while, but because it's so successful, the studios will bring it back in to be vertically integrated because they've created so much value outside the system, and the cycle continues.
I'm going to disagree with John respectfully and disrespectfully, because it's one of the big changes now is it's very hard to even get in the door in some ways. like it is, I just did a pilot project, and I knew, like, right from the word go, I said, why don't we take it to network X? And the answer was, we can't sell to network X. We can't strike a deal with network X. And so I may have the greatest idea ever, but if the studio I'm partnered with doesn't sell to network X, or network X won't buy from them, then you're already at a disadvantage. And the other point I would make that sort of feeds my respectful disagreement is, it's like, take these mega mergers in the last year. Like, I think that, as I said, there was a story before COVID, and one of the big stories that I don't think the industry has, certainly in my world, has fully reckoned with, were the two big developments of Rupert Murdoch selling off the studio, like all the Fox studios, to Disney, and sort of the sub-story of Disney launching a streaming service, and the other big story of AT&T buying Time Warner. So, you know, in particular, the latter, you have a massive telecommunications company headquartered in Dallas buying what is the most old line Hollywood studio. Like, Warner Brothers is the studio that pays the star $20 million. And then when the movie opens, great, they give them a Range Rover as a thank you. Being a little bit tongue in cheek about that. But that model, with AT&T ownership, and AT&T is so leveraged up, they took on so much debt that the pressure, if you're a strategic planning executive of AT&T, at least again, in my opinion, you're saying, why am I buying a show from Universal? Let's buy it from Warner Brothers so that we can control everything. And this is, I think it's that environment, like, while you're not wrong that a voice can always get through, I think it's getting harder because the walls are higher and the walls are thicker. They're harder to penetrate.
Yeah, the only response I would have to that would be that if you take that approach that AT&T and the Warner Brothers sort of colossus is becoming, my prediction would be that they're not going to be successful because they're going to force everything inside, and then you'd end up seeing in time a divestiture because they can't kind of get the returns that they expected they could get, and it just doesn't work long term in that environment. And so they'll end up spinning off Warner Brothers, and it'll get chopped up into different pieces or something like that. Or there will be this interesting boutique agency come out of some TikTok creators or something like that that will have latched onto something that will have created a brand, some form of IP that we haven't even conceived of yet. And then that will be the direction where people will go, and they'll say, see, these big, huge conglomerates don't work anymore. I mean, you know, how long ago, it wasn't that long ago when we all looked enviously at the Walt Disney Company saying that is the model for the future. And now you start to worry about, holy mackerel, is the Walt Disney Company going to be able to survive?
But I think the pattern you're describing, and I think it's a great observation, it's going to take 5, 8, 10 years. In the meantime, I have a great idea. I want to sell it, but, you know, Studio Y doesn't sell to network X.
My idea would help you personally, Leonard. It help the future creative minds down the road.
I'll make it an animation project and bring it to Philip.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, certainly, you know, there's been a major shift even just prior to this whole thing in the animation industry in terms of, you know, where we're looking to get eyeballs on content and everything from, you know, the animation as a pure art form and storytelling tool to it being a method for building brands and toys and so on and so forth. Nothing wrong with either of those things, certainly, but you know, very short form content, you know, shows that are designed for streaming, either, you know, the AVODs or the SVODs that are, you know, 2-3 minutes long, these very short things. And certainly now, and I don't know if, Leonard, if you've had any experience with the new Quibi service that's out there, which is sort of that expanded you know, short form content universe that's out there. I think a lot of us are looking at it with, you know, trepidation as to whether or not that's going to work. But certainly in animation, we've seen a number of things very successful, you know, that are designed to be short and quick and just get eyeballs on them for a very short period of time, and lots and lots of discussion about how to make things that are of a higher level of quality than a number of things that we're seeing out there, and then, you know, where to go for monetization of those kind of things.
Well, we could go on for a while, but I know that we're coming up to the end right now. I'm just going to throw out one last question to everybody. 12 months from now, is the business back to normal? Or back to some sort of new normal?
I'll jump on that, at least from sort of from the sports point of view. I'd say no. I mean, if you define normal as being full stadiums full of fans watching their favorite sports and cheering them on, I think the live event experience is going to be significantly compromised for probably 2 years or more. I think you'll also start to see the rights deals start to temper a little bit, because it's been going up to renew the football rights or the basketball rights or something like that. And I just don't think that the existing ecosystem can sustain that going forward.
Okay. Leonard?
I will say, I'll agree with John. I will say no for several reasons, but also a reason that may not necessarily be obvious, which is that much of my part of the industry is based in California, and California, in my opinion, has done a great job. They've been very vigilant about this. So until we get to, whether it's flattening the curve or a vaccine, I think it's going to be hard to return to something resembling what March 12th looked like.
Okay. Philip?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the actual content itself, I think things will be, largely back to normal in terms of the finished results, but the process of how to get there is definitely changing radically. We went from certainly in my position, lots and lots of travel, lots of trying to get FaceTime with people in person and for selling and pitching ideas and things like that. And now everything is sort of going virtual. And as I said, artists working remotely and so on. And the methodology by which things get put together, I think, is not going to go back to the way it was before. Possibly to a benefit, possibly with some new challenges, but we'll take it as it comes.
Well, all I know is that we all have lots of good stories to look forward to. Thank you all for a really great dynamic panel today, and thank the audience as well for participating.